The church I'm going to introduce you to in this short video is an unusual survival. It's an untouched late Georgian period piece. What is more, it is to be found in a quite stunning location, which rather adds to the whole romance of this wonderful building. This is the old parish church of St Stephen at Fylingdales, just to the south of Whitby in North Yorkshire, and it sits a little inland, all alone in its churchyard, with expansive views east towards the North Sea. Now, churches in this part of Yorkshire are few and far between, as the population here was very dispersed, and the parish this church once served was enormous and had various settlements within it, including the picturesque fishing village of Robin Hood's Bay, the village of Fylingthorpe, and the hamlet of Raw, and a scattering of remote farmsteads high up on the North York moors. The landscape here has a particularly pleasing, rugged charm about it, and the church is located just at the point where the bleak heather of the North York moors gives way to a delightful patchwork of stone-walled, undulating fields that slope rapidly down towards the sea. The church itself is set in a precariously sloped churchyard that is bristling with early Victorian headstones. It's a really stunning spot, and my drone footage, taken on a day of misty brooding weather, gives a real impression of what it is like to stand on this bleak spot. There has been a church on this spot since at least the 12th century, but nothing now remains of the medieval building that once stood here. By the late 18th century, the medieval church was in a dire need of restoration or replacement. It was too small, it was dark, and its fabric was ailing. The decision was therefore made in 1821 to knock down the old building and build the present church on the old footings. It's unlikely that a formal architect was consulted, and both the design and the construction work of this new church was put into the hands of a local builder. The church is constructed in a Georgian vernacular version of the Gothic style, what is often termed churchwarden's Gothic. It's not slavishly medieval in its details. And it blends features from classical vernacular architecture too. The little cupola on the roof that contains a single bell would not be out of place on a stable block of a country house. The new church was complete by the end of 1822, and it cost the grand sum of £855 and 18 shillings. The cost of the rebuilding work was borne partly by public subscription, but there were one or two major benefactors, the principal of whom was a local Whitby shipbuilder called Robert Barry, who had 3 years before purchased the Fylings Hall estate. The church would only serve the parish for a mere 48 years. For in 1858 a new, young and energetic vicar would be appointed to the parish, called the Reverend John German Cooper. From a long-established clerical family, German Cooper was an Oxford graduate. Like many young Oxford-educated clergymen of his generation, he was influenced by the High Church Oxford movement that sought to bring some Catholic dignity and ritual back to Anglican worship. He brought those ideas to his New Yorkshire parish, and he found that the 1822 church, built for a rather austere Protestant form of worship, was not a place where he could develop his ritualist principles in worship. And so in the 1860s, this church was replaced by a brand new Gothic church built in Fylingthorpe opposite Mr Cooper's vicarage. This new church, which cost £6,000, was designed by the fashionable architect G.E. Street and was completed in 1870. Now, there was some local annoyance in 1870 when the new church made this church on its ancient site obsolete. But in the face of some initial resistance from his parishioners, rather than having this church demolished, Mr German Cooper simply stopped using it and he locked it. And there it stood, completely unused, although the roof was kept watertight, for the remainder of Mr German Cooper's ministry in this parish. And it was a very long ministry indeed. He outlived all his local critics, dying, still as Vicar of Fylingdales, loved and venerable, in his 80s in 1916. Rather ironically, he was buried in this churchyard, the churchyard of the old church he had closed. Now, I think we owe Mr German Cooper a great vote of thanks for what he did. It is due to his actions that Old St Stephen's is now a rewarding church for us to visit. While most churches were stripped of their Georgian furnishings in the Gothic revival of the 19th century, as this church was locked up and abandoned in 1870, it is now a very rare thing, an unspoiled late Georgian time warp. It retains all of its original late Georgian furnishings and provides therefore a rare insight into late Georgian worship in the Church of England. So let's go inside. Almost the entirety of this church building is filled with pews, and around two sides of the interior are galleries supported on cast iron pillars that provide further seating in the upper parts of the church. The church is designed, in theory at least, to accommodate most of the inhabitants of this very spread out parish. The pews are typical of the Georgian period. They are what are termed box pews, each one an individual compartment made of wainscot. They are designed this way as a practical expedient against cold draughts. The pews in this church are still painted just as they were when the church was completed in 1822, the exterior of them painted in 2 tones of buff paint and the interior of the pews in a sort of dove grey. It's a charming period detail. The most dominant piece of furniture in this church is the pulpit, and it is what is called a triple-decker pulpit. In other words, it has 3 decks or levels, each for a particular purpose. The lowest deck was designed for the use of the parish clerk, while the centre deck was the stall of the minister of the parish, the vicar. Now, the primary service offered on a Sunday in this church in 1822 would have been the office of matins, morning prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, and from the pulpit, the minister and the parish clerk would perform a sort of double act as the service was conducted. For the sermon, the minister would leave his central stall and would go to the octagonal third deck of the pulpit, from which he would then preach. Now, you'll notice above this top deck that there is a board suspended from the wall above the pulpit, and this is a sounding board, a primitive amplification system. Now, all the pews in the church are designed, wherever they are, to face towards this triple-decker pulpit. For in Georgian churches, it wasn't the altar, the communion table, that was the focus of worship, but this towering pulpit. There is, of course, a communion table in the church, in the short chancel at the east end of the building, but it is rather lost among all the pews. It was always a secondary feature in Georgian churches, for Holy Communion was only rarely celebrated. Indeed, in most rural parishes like Fylingdales, it was celebrated only a handful of times a year. Parishioners only really came to communion 3 times a year, at Christmas, Easter and Whitsun. You'll notice that there is no stained glass in the church. There are no painted images and devotional pictures of any sort in this interior. This is very much a pared down and spare Protestant space, a place for the proclaiming and the hearing of the word, rather than a place for sacramental and numinous encounter with God. That is one of the reasons, no doubt, that the Reverend Mr. German Cooper was keen to have a new church, and indeed that new church is full of stained glass. The church was, of course, a place where the whole community gathered in this period, and churches of this sort are arranged in a very hierarchical fashion. You couldn't just turn up to church and sit where you liked. You'll notice that all the pews have numbers on them. Individual family groups within the parish would have paid an annual rent to sit in these pews. And just as in a theatre there are boxes and cheap seats, so it was within a Georgian parish church like this. Some pews were more expensive to rent than others. The more expensive pews were the ones where you got a better view of the pulpit and where everybody else got a better view of you. The prime spot in Fylingdales Church is in the North Gallery, where the grandest pew is placed directly opposite the pulpit. It is marked out from all the rest by having a rather fine panelled front, painted duck egg blue with faux wood graining. Those who sat here could both see and, importantly, be seen. This is most probably the pew of the Barry family of Filing Hall, who were the wealthiest inhabitants in the parish. Remember, Robert Barry was a major benefactor of the church. The pew is lined on the inside for comfort with green baize. There is another prominent pew close to the chancel, which is labelled with the coat of arms and the name of the family who occupied it, the Farside family. While the Barrys were new money in Fylingdales, the Farsides were an old established family in the parish who lived at Fylingthorpe Hall and were lords of the manor. In the chancel are a number of monuments to them. The pew rent system did have the effect in many English churches of excluding a lot of the poor who had nowhere to sit. Many of them, as a consequence, went off to the chapels of the Methodists. But in the early 19th century, some attempts were made to address the problem by providing in churches like this free sittings for the poor. A new organisation, the Society for Promoting the Enlargement of Churches, was founded in 1818 to provide grants to parishes to provide seating for the poor. As a large board at the back of this church informs us, the Society gave £150 in 1822 when the church was being built to provide 112 free sittings for the poor of the parish. They were accommodated in the pews numbered 1 to 14 at the very back in the northwest corner of the church, the place with the worst view of the pulpit and where they couldn't be seen. 112 free sittings would have been nowhere near enough to accommodate the poor of a farming and fishing community like Fylingdales. When the new church was built in 1870, all of the sittings in it were free. The poor were often forgotten in the past. There is, however, a wonderful, rare and poignant memorial to some of the poor of Fylingdales parish in the form of a collection of ephemeral folk objects hanging up in the church called maidens' garlands. These objects were once a common feature of Georgian funerals, but very few now remain, as they were generally tidied away or chucked away in churches that were in constant use. The garlands are made of ribbon wrapped around a wicker frame, and they were customarily carried before the coffins of unmarried women as they were taken for burial, and were then hung up from the ceiling above the pew occupied by the deceased. The 3 garlands that have survived at Fylingdales all date from the 1850s, just before the church was closed, and again they owe their survival to the obsolescence of the building. Rather darkened and tattered now, there is a reconstruction hanging up that gives an impression of their original vibrancy. It really doesn't take much to imagine this lovely church in Fylingdales populated with people in the 1820s. Down-to-earth fishermen sat in pews beside labourers. Farmers, butchers and bakers were all cheek at jowl, mixing with the local gentry, and everyone of whatever social status, high or low, were dressed in their Sunday best, as they listened to a thundering sermon from the vicar standing 6 foot above contradiction in the towering pulpit. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.